thanks for coming. I say I have a lot of friends, so I'm expecting to get some heckling. Hold it till the end if you can, but if you're compelled, go ahead. So I'm going to share with you just a little bit of what's been happening with seals and sea lions during the past half century, just offshore, just out here. And I might say a few things about what I think might happen in the next half century, but I'm not going to be here. So if I'm wrong, yeah, I don't care. And if I'm right, it won't matter. So I'll see what I can do. So I'm going to talk to you about, there's 6 species. They're all marine carnivores. Pinnipeds is a term you've used. It's an artificial taxon, but it kind of lumps them. But they're distinct. There are 3 families in these marine carnivores that we see: the Odobenids, which are the walrus; the Phocidae, which are the true seals, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about. There are 2 species in the area, and then the Odorheids, which are the sea lions and the fur seals. So they're all marine carnivores, but they're often lumped together as pinnipeds, although I think that's not a good thing to do. But I'm going to avoid that term, but I'm going to tell you about their lives and what's been happening to them anyway. So there are 4 species of Odorheids. I have to turn this thing. That have lived or do live part of the year, at least, on the Southern California Channel Islands. California sea lions, they were at pretty low abundance, only a few thousand of them in the 1940s around the islands. Stellar sea lion, which has been absent since the 80s, although there are a couple around here, and if you go out the harbor, you'll see, I think, occasionally a young male that's hauled out on the buoy. So they're around. Their population has been increasing in southeast Alaska and the Gulf, so they may be starting to show up a little bit further south here, and we might see a few more. But they haven't bred on the islands for several decades. Guadalupe fur seals, they are presumed extinct by the late 1800s, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them. So they're the 3rd species that we see. So 2 sea lions and then 2 fur seals, including the northern fur seal, which is a recent colonist. Its primary colonies are in the Bering Sea, Pribilof Islands in the central Bering Sea, and then on the Russian side at various islands in the western Bering Sea, northwestern Pacific. And then 2 species of true seals, the phocids, northern elephant seal, which you don't really see much unless you go out to the islands. But if you go there, you'll see a lot of them these days. And harbor seals, which they're along the coast here, a good colony at Point Mugu Lagoon, and then up and down the coast, Carpinteria, the little colony there, and they're on all the Channel Islands in various abundances. So those are the ones I'm going to tell you a little bit about. I don't know how long it's going to take me to get through this. I'd like to go through a bit quickly. I might not be so successful at that, but I want to leave time for questions because I find those are actually the most informative things and helpful things rather than me just talking to you for an hour. So the first species, a true seal, northern elephant seal. If you've been to the islands, like I said, you've seen them. If you've been to San Miguel during the winter, or even up the coast, they haul out and breed at Piedras Blancas. Large numbers there. It's over several thousand pups now born a year, but that's fairly recent. So the picture in the background is Point Bennett at San Miguel Island. This was in the mid-1980s when that beach was as populated as it ever has been. Numbers are quite a bit lower there, but they've spread out to the other beaches on San Miguel and then also over to Santa Rosa Island. But this is the trend of the population. They were eliminated, we think, by subsistence hunting by the Indians, Aboriginals that lived on the islands, hunted for several thousand years. And by the time Europeans got here, there weren't really very many. If you read Scammond's accounts and other romantic historical accounts, they talk about them. But a lot of that turns out have been borrowed from some of the southern elephant sealing literature. But by the time that Europeans arrived here, there weren't many left, but they did kill them. A couple of episodes of hunting them for oil, mostly accessory to the whaling that was going on in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, even into the early 1900s. So they were not very common here. There were a few on the islands, and some of the whalers continued to take them for oil. And by the late 1800s, there were only a few left, and they were at Guadalupe Island. They were proclaimed extinct in the late 1800s, just after the species had actually been described. And the reason for that is most of the museums at the time had no samples of this species. There was one type specimen that had been collected, but that was really about it. The Smithsonian Institution heard that there were some animals still at Guadalupe in the early 1880s, and they sent an expedition out there to kill what they could. That was kind of the plan. I mean, that was the science then, is you study things by often killing them, bird collecting and mammal collecting. But that was the early explorations of science in that time. So they found, this was in summer, early to midsummer, and they found 8 elephant seals ashore at Guadalupe Island, and they shot at all of them. They killed 8, or killed 7, and one of them apparently escaped. So I'll tell you what I think that they actually survived that, and I think I'll show you that some of the data that we've collected in the last couple of decades, why all of them weren't eliminated. But they reappeared, started reappearing in California, Alta California, in the early 20th century, and started appearing on the Channel Islands. But the first pups were not born until about the 1950s at San Miguel and at San Nicolas. There were a few births, and this graph is births, which we use. It's the number of pups born each year, which we can actually keep track of. We could try to count the whole population that's on the beaches, but that's not really reflective of what's out there. So the number of births each year is a good indicator of how the population might be doing, and we can supplement that with other studies by tagging seals and looking at survival, migration, immigration, emigration. But they started out pretty low. Their first burst in the late 1950s, and it's been increasing exponentially for the population in the U.S. This is actually just the Channel Islands for the past 100 years. It's a pretty remarkable story, and I've actually witnessed that for the last several decades. Well, since I started in the late 70s, has been pretty remarkable, especially since we often study animals that are in serious decline, habitat destruction, and killing. And the sea lion pattern is similar to this, and there are really, at least for elephant seals, I think 3 reasons that they've recovered so well. The first is that humans stopped killing them, and Guadalupe the Mexicans established Guadalupe as a nature reserve in the early 1900s, and then we started appearing in the Channel Islands in California. There really wasn't much of an interest in hunting them or killing them anymore for oil, because there were replacements, as in whaling, for oil. So that stopped. The second thing was that the breeding habitats, mostly then at San Nicolas Island, San Miguel Island, were both Navy-owned islands. So intrusion was limited, and then of course San Miguel came under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service, so very little intrusion. So there was very little disturbance to the breeding habitat. And the third thing I think that really contributed to these increases is that the prey of these animals, which really wasn't known until fairly recently, wasn't being exploited and eliminated to any extent during the period that they were recovering. So the large-scale fisheries developed much later, and for elephant seals, humans still haven't figured a good way to get to their prey, which I'll show you where that lives. So the recolonization of the Channel Islands in the 50s, it's been increasing at San Nicolas and San Miguel steadily, and then the first births at Pam Yoakum and I documented at Santa Rosa Island in, I think, 1985. There were 2 births, 2 pups born at the western end of the island at Sandy Point in 1985, and I think and then they continued to move eastward along the south side of Santa Rosa Island, and this year there were about 8,000 pups born on the island, so from 30 years ago to 8,000. And I think they're going to hit Santa Cruz Island. If you know that island, the southwestern beaches are pretty good habitat. They still haven't gotten into Becker's Bay yet at Santa Rosa Island. That's really good habitat, or the spit that's there on the south side of the bay. So the population was reduced to just about nothing. I've worked with a couple of colleagues' collaborations to look at what the effects were on the genetic composition. And this was a big topic in the early 70s when scientists first started having the ability to look at genetic variability, initially with protein electrophoresis. And that's what was accomplished in the 1970s with a couple of protein systems. And that study found very little genetic variability in northern elephant seals. We've repeated that in mitochondrial DNA and nuclear genome, and including the immunogenetic system, and we found that virtually nothing. So a lot was lost. We don't know when it occurred, but we know that the populations were at reduced levels for a long, long time, and that's when variability really tends to be lost out of the population. When you get a single population reduction, you're going to lose often the rare alleles, but most of the rest of it will be maintained if the population recovers quickly. Elephant seals were just depressed for a long, long time. We think that explains why there's virtually no genetic variability in the population. But nonetheless, they've done quite well, and they've been increasing for a long time at very high rates. Pam Yoakum and I and Walter Boyce at UC Davis and some other colleagues looked at avian influenza a couple of years ago because it was starting to show up in a lot of wildlife species. And we found that there was an epidemic that went through the elephant seal population several years ago, which was also striking because we didn't see any evidence of mortality. And avian influenza is pretty deadly, but we didn't see any evidence that elephant seals were dying from that. All we were able to do is detect antibodies to the flu virus. So they continue to be an interesting species for a lot of reasons, and their vitality and their persistence is still pretty remarkable. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about why I think, and others think, that they weren't completely eliminated, and we didn't really start to get to this until the 1980s when we started to wonder where they were actually going when they're not on the beaches. So if you visit the islands, if you go in January, December and January, you see a lot of animals on the beaches. It's breeding season. If you come back in spring, about right now, you'll find a lot because it's molting season. But in between, the beaches are pretty lean. And then from about September through about December, they're vacant. There really aren't many elephant seals around on the beaches. So we were kind of wondering where they were going, what they were doing, what they were eating, how they were fueling these population increases. So I worked with Bob DeLong, who's a wildlife biologist at NOAA Fisheries in Seattle, and Roger Hill of Wildlife Computers, who I'd worked with in the Antarctic to study some other seal species, crab-eater seals, on what they were doing when they were trying to find food. And with Roger and Bob, we developed and tested what's called a time depth recorder. It's used in most marine wildlife now. It's pretty ubiquitous in its application. But it had never been used on elephant seals. And the first step we were really trying to deal with is where are they in the water column? Because we had no way to track them then. Satellite telemetry had not really come out. It was starting to develop, but the packages were big and not suited for the marine environment. So we really worked with Roger and extended the work that we had done in the Antarctic with crab-eater seals and developed an instrument and then tested on northern elephant seals. And this is actually one of the ones we used, one of the prototypes. It's a time depth recorder, and it records seawater temperature, hydrostatic pressure, which is depth, and then later we added a light level sensor, which I'll tell you about in the second stage. So we scraped a little bit of money together, couldn't get funded because everybody said, this is crazy. You'll never recover them, and if you do, they won't work. So we did it anyway, and we were really surprised. We instrumented 8 animals at San Miguel in 1988 and 89 and recovered 7 of the instruments, and I think 5 of them had worked. This actually came in. This is still the deepest dive record that we have from this instrument. So they're time depth recorders. They tell you where the animal is spending its time in the water column. This had a whopping 256 kilobytes of memory. That's kilobytes. You guys know what that means. Some audiences don't get it. It's not megabytes. It's not gigabytes. It's kilobytes. So, but that allowed us to record on those 3 channels measurements every 30 to 60 seconds for up to about 2.5 months, which is perfect for after the breeding season for females. and pushing it for males, because males are going for about 6 months between breeding and molting, and then molting and breeding. So we applied these, we got them back, and they worked. And this is what some of the dive records look like. And I'm going to tell you, I might say this again, that once these animals leave the beaches, so you're out there, you see them, they're just lying around, they look like doing nothing but resting, making babies, and then doing nothing during the molt. But they're on the beaches for anywhere from 30 days to up to 3 months for males during the breeding season, and then about 30 days during the molt season. But when they're not there, they're working, and they're working all the time. It's continuous. I have one file on this that shows you what a 3-month record looks like, what a 6-month record is. And what you see here is 1 day of diving. It starts here at midnight, goes all the way down to midnight. These are 6-hour blocks. This is depth from the surface down to here, 1,200 meters on this scale. So as soon as the animal goes into the water, it starts diving, and it doesn't stop. Occasionally, they'll spend an hour or two at the surface. But this goes on relentlessly for the entire time the animal's at sea. Then they come ashore, and of course they stop diving. We think they're feeding, they're trying to catch food and eating food the whole time, either replenishing the fat that they lost when they were fasting during the breeding season and molt, and also preparing for the next fast that they're going to go through. So they're out there aggressively trying to find food and adding weight, and then they come ashore and their appetite just switch goes off. They don't even think about eating. So that's what the dive records look like. Those are the first data we got back from these instruments, and then we started wondering where they were going. But this might be a little tricky to get. This is the annual cycle of a female, adult female on this scale. So we start here at January 1, I think, January, right here. Where is it? 0, and it goes all the way around to December 31st on both scales. Adult males down here, adult females, and each one of these dots is the maximum depth of the dive. So if you were to look at these, you would take each one of these, and we just plotted that on that figure, and what that shows you is where they're spending time in the water column. And this is about 600 meters. You see there's some scatter around there, but females are living at around 600 to 800 meters here for about 2.5 months. This is the blue is when they're on the beach, so that's the breeding season. Female will go to sea then, spend about 2.5 months at sea, come back to the beach, and then spend about a month there, and then she's at sea for about 8 months and diving continuously then. And males are a little bit different. This is about a 2 to 3 month period on the beach during the breeding season. They go to the sea and then come back later, usually in August or September to molt, and then they're gone for about an equal period before they come back to the beaches in December to start establishing themselves on beaches and defending their right to breed females when they come into estrus. So that's the annual cycle for those two. We've got a little bit more data on juveniles and how their patterns change as they grow up, and I'm going to save that till another time. So that told us what they were doing at sea, at least with respect to the water column, but we still didn't know where they were going. And as I said, the satellite telemetry was not really working well for us yet. We were developing it, and I'd been testing it in some other places, but it really wasn't quite prepared. And one I didn't mention about this tube is this is titanium. So we thought that elephant seals might be deep divers just because of their physical structure and their physiology that we knew about. So we knew we had to armor it against seawater and pressure, and modified it from the shallower diving animals we'd studied in the Antarctic. But we didn't know where they were going, but Roger had a great idea. He said, well, let's use day length to try and estimate where they are. And this is a method that had been around. All of the math for this had been worked out in the 1700s by Nathaniel Bowditch. So the math was already there, and Roger just said, well, he could create an algorithm, and you iterate. And you basically take all the light level data you get back out of the instrument, and you start guessing until you get very narrowed down to a location. And from the light levels, we get latitude from day length, which was an old nautical method, again, for centuries. Longitude was always the problem, but we have a really accurate clock in here. If you know the story of longitude, that was the big competition of if you leave an area, your clock starts getting offset and it's hard to keep time, so you can't easily keep track of longitude. Latitude is pretty straightforward, but longitude's pretty difficult. So we had an accurate clock, we had daylight, we were started to collect ambient daylight at the surface and at depth, and then when we recovered the instruments, we could run this through an algorithm and give us estimates of latitude and longitude once each day that were accurate to about 60 nautical miles. We didn't know how that was going to work because we didn't know if the seals were staying around the area. The literature at the time said they don't move, they just hang around the Channel Islands. That was just a guess. And this is what we got back on the first couple instruments. Again, we followed up our diving studies. We submitted proposals to continue the work, and we got the same answer. You're crazy. It's not going to work, and we're not going to believe it if you do get it back anyway. So we kept it going, lived on ramen for 2-minute noodles for quite a long time, at least I did. And then we got this back. And these are females on this side and males on this side. And remember, there are 2 periods when they're at sea. So what we discovered from these data in the early 90s was that there are 2 migrations for elephant seals a year. That was surprising. What was also surprising is they travel over long distances. These are females that leave the beach after the breeding season. They go way out here into the Central Pacific, 2.5 months, and then they find their way directly back to these little specks at San Miguel and San Nicolas Islands. How they do that, we still don't know. We're trying to devise some tricks to figure out what they're doing and what they know they can do and they do regularly. This is the second migration for females, so once they finish molting, they leave again and they go further. One goes way across to past the international date line, then they come back. They're feeding that whole time, getting ready to give birth. So their pup is growing, again, while it's under pressure, because the females are living at 600 to 800 meters most of the time, not breathing. They're surviving on the oxygen they store in their tissues. The pups are growing, and then the females find their way back easily and haul out and give birth. Males are a little bit different. The ones we were studying went way up to the Aleutian Islands, Gulf of Alaska. They traveled through the areas the females were then feeding in, but continued to go past it. And the same thing with the second migration, which was after the molt or the breeding season. So that's what we learned from elephant seals, and that is why I think that they saved themselves, in a sense, because they just weren't around when these last hunters and sealers were looking for them. Remember, the Smithsonian went out in summer, and that's when very few animals are around, some adult males and some adult males, but they weren't visiting the colonies in winter anymore. And in fact, even the sealers weren't. When the Indians were occupying the islands full time, they had access to them on these beaches all the time, and they were, like I said, hunting them over several centuries. And they're easy prey when they're on the beaches because they just sit there. I don't know how I've never tasted an elephant seal, but I imagine they're nourishing because they're loaded with oil and fat. I mean, they're good food to sustain. I don't know what the meat tastes like. So that's how I think they survived, and they've done really well. Again, a really remarkable conservation story that we continue to be a bit shocked by because they're continuing to increase in number and in range. Okay, California sea lions. This is the other big one. The other 4 species I'm going to go through quickly because you don't see them that often, but I'm going to give you a brief description of what's been happening. California sea lions are another very obvious species on the Channel Islands. Again, there were just a very few thousand of them in the 1940s. They had been hunted, but they had been killed indiscriminately and shot and used for a lot of different things, particularly in the 1800s and 1900s. They may have been eliminated from a lot of places on the Channel Islands by the Aboriginal inhabitants, but they always have little refuges because they do haul out in places that are really difficult to get to. And the genetics work suggested that there were a lot more that were still around and probably in a lot more places because they didn't lose as much genetic variability as northern elephant seals. But I also forgot to mention with elephant seals, we went back into the archaeological record and extracted DNA from the trash dump, Indian middens, trash dumps from elephant seals that we presumed were killed 100 years to maybe 1,000 years ago. And we were able to document a little bit about the loss of variability over that longer period of time. Sea lions have a lot, demonstrate more genetic variability. There's a lot more mixing, we think. But this is the pattern for California sea lions in the Channel Islands since the 1950s. It's been a steady increase to today, but you see a lot more variability. These are also the number of pups that are born each year. A lot more variability. And that's because the system that they live in and they forage in is quite a bit different than elephant seals. These animals are really tied to and live in and forage in upwelling systems. You know, if you've spent much time offshore, you know it's a pretty rich area, but it's a coastal upwelling and just offshore upwelling system because of the complex bathymetry. There are eddies that are formed that stimulate upwelling of nutrients, and there are also generally strong northwest winds, particularly right now in spring, that stimulate upwelling of nutrients, and we get into long days and a lot of prey produced. So if something happens to those upwelling systems, which I think happened this last year and in 2012 and 13, the prey doesn't do so well because the phytoplankton is not there because the nutrients are not at the surface. So things decline and their foraging abilities get quite a bit more challenging. So you see a lot more variability in the number of pups born. The really deep drops, this was the 82, 83 El Nino warm water event, and that's produces similar things that happened this last year, although we didn't have an El Nino. It's starting to develop now. But the same thing happens is the winds drop, upwelling declines, phytoplankton production drops, and there's not really a lot for the animals to feed. Okay for the older animals, but what generally happens in these years is the females abandon the pups. And the pups have a hard time making it. And that's what we saw this last year and 2 years ago, is that the females abandon their pups early, fall starting, and the pups normally suckle for about a year, almost a year, until the breeding season next May. And the pups weren't doing well because they weren't really being attended by the females who just dropped them. They're out there looking for prey and they're not really doing very well. So that's what happens in El Nino years. Warm water event years like this a really intense one here, and then a couple interesting events here. And then we see also the following year generally that there are fewer pups born because the females might not have been impregnated, or they may not be in good enough condition because of the challenging foraging conditions to carry a fetus to full term. So a lot more variability in California sea lions. But overall, the population has been increasing at about, I think, 5 to 8% for quite a long time. We're probably going to see a lot more of this happening, especially this year. What we expect this summer on the islands is that births will decline again because there are fewer females that were likely impregnated last year. But what seems to not have happened during this whole period, particularly down in here, is that adult survival was not influenced, so that once that the females were impregnated, there was still a good standing stock of adults. Juveniles might have had delayed maturity because they weren't feeding and they weren't growing as fast. Then we're probably going to see a lot more variability in the future years, depending on what's happened. And I'm not even going to try to predict that. We're just seeing a lot more of these warm water events and then these other interesting events that happened 2 years ago and that's happened last fall and this winter. So some of you have been involved in this. This has been a big year for animals, California sea lions coming into rehabilitation centers. They've been, the media has said that they're stranding. A lot of these animals are really, I don't think, stranding. They're coming ashore to rest. Some of them are in very poor condition. But these pups are ones that have come from the islands. They're looking for food. There have been local patches of food around, around Santa Barbara, Ventura, Camarillo, and even down to LA. And those patches are not continuously distributed. I think if you go out whale watching, or if you have been the last few years, you notice these patches. There's food around, it's just very patchy. They're humpback whales now, they're resident almost year-round. I mean, they're transient animals. Blue whales you can see quite a lot. But they find these patches. If you run into these, you'll see cormorants, pelicans, sea lions, white-sided dolphins, common dolphins. They're all in these patches. So the pups are finding them, but by the time they do, they may not be in good condition. And if they're feeding locally, then instead of going back to the islands to haul out to rest, they're coming ashore. But nonetheless, there have been a lot of animals that are picked up. The total as of early this month for this year was about 3,000. SeaWorld has handled over 700. Some of them have signs of disease, but they're secondary factors. The key thing is dehydration and malnutrition. And once the animals are fed, if they're not really seriously compromised, they gain weight pretty rapidly. So the rehabilitation centers are required by federal law to return these animals, and they are doing that. And some of them restrand, but we're trying to monitor as many as we can with some satellite telemetry to find out how they're doing when they are returned. That's an expensive a method. I wish we could do a lot more, because then we could feed this back to both the NOAA managers and to the rehabilitation centers. But that's kind of the pattern. It's been going back since 2004, and you see heavy years. This year, it was started in December. Again, the pups were abandoned beginning in late fall when the food started declining for females to get. And then 2 years ago in 2012, 2013, when there was another big event, independent of an El Nino, but it was, again, this appeared to be a decline in the food chain, a catastrophic change in the food chain that affected everything. And I think we're starting to see that with other predators. We're also, now we are having an El Nino developing. It's been talked about for the last year in the media. NOAA's tried to predict it. It's a tough thing to do, but warm water is starting to show up in the Galapagos. So it's coming across the Pacific. Not the warm water that's killing things, it's really the change in circulation patterns, the link between oceanic circulation, atmospheric circulation, so that the nutrients are not coming to the surface. And there's no upwelling, so that also means the water's warm. But it's not the warm water that's really the culprit. It's really a lack of prey. These are the annual strandings, again, just to show you where it's occurred. And it's varied this year in 2009, which was a strong El Nino year. A lot from we're coming ashore in Northern California, but for the most part, it's Southern California that gets most of the animals on the beaches and the recoveries. And you get years like this El Nino here, and then this event in 2012-13, and the data for this year are not up here yet. And then this just shows you the seasonal pattern of it. Most of the animals really peak in March, starting in late January, and then dropping off about right now. Their animals are still coming on the beaches and being picked up, but that's probably going to decline, and we might see some more of it through the summer if food goes away, and the surviving pups, which will then be yearlings, have a difficult time finding food. Okay, so I think I've already mentioned some of this, the explanatory scenario, which I think accounts for this, is regional changes in atmospheric circulation, gross reduction and upwelling of nutrients. You've got to get those to the surface, particularly in spring when there's longer days, and you have phytoplankton blooms generally throughout the Southern California bight. And then catastrophic collapses of the local food chain. And you may have seen in the press, there's been talk about overfishing of anchovies or sardines and a decline in those stocks. Although they're important prey for California sea lions, the biggest prey that it seems in the last decade or perhaps longer to enhance the survival of animals that are living here during the winter has been market squid. And that's been a big resource. Market squid fishery has done very, very well. 2 years ago, it did well enough that they shut the fishery down early in, I think, November. So nobody's monitoring what's going on. But squid became very scarce after that during the winter. At the same time, there was a big production and harvest of market squid in Northern California. So it's very dynamic, very mobile, but what seems to happen is a lot of the prey that these animals depend on, upwelling system predators, just vanished for some reason. I think that's the really curious thing, and I don't think that we have a good answer for what's happened and whether that's going to continue to be an annual thing or not, but we'll see. So these are some of the rehabilitated California sea lion pups that we returned, that SeaWorld returned in April, I think, February, March, or April of 2013 after that event. And we had 6 animals that we tracked. And they didn't go back to the Channel Islands, but they continued to stay along the coast, but moved all over the place. And there are others that were tagged and released, returned by other rehabilitation centers, including here in Santa Barbara. And the patterns were about the same, although a couple animals did go out to Anacapa, Santa Cruz for a bit. But all the 6 that we released, stayed coastal for the most part, except for this. There were 2 animals that were way down here into Baja and finally went off the air. So difficult. The patterns, there is no standard pattern other than they remained coastal and they seemed to get into patches of prey. Or they hung around places that were actively, had sport or commercial fishing where they could get in there and borrow food. To pay back later, of course. Harbor seals, just briefly, you'll see them, especially if you're out diving. They're really hard to see otherwise because they're a bit spooky, but they're hauling out on all the Channel Islands. They breed there. But the numbers, again, were very, very low in the 1930s and 40s. Started increasing. This is just the Channel Islands. They started increasing in the late 60s and then seemed to have plateaued on the Channel Islands and now seem to be stable. But they're different kind of predators. They're foraging in epibenthic and benthic habitats pretty near the islands or the coastline, which seem to be a lot less affected, if at all, by warm water El Nino events or these failures in the coastal upwelling systems that we've seen over the last 4 years. Northern fur seals. This is an interesting species because it historically isn't thought to have occurred in the Channel Islands, but a colony was discovered in the mid-1960s at San Miguel Island, and it's been increasing fairly rapidly. It's still fairly small. These are the number of pups that are born out there each year. Two different places, Point Bennett on the beaches there, and then at Castle Rock. NOAA has been monitoring this since the 60s. Their trend. It was mandatory to monitor it until the 80s because we had U.S. was a signatory to the Antarctic or the Fur Seal Treaty, which was a joint treaty with Japan, Russia, Canada, really the UK for Canada, and that was to prevent harvest of females at sea. The agreement, none of them would kill fur seals at sea, but there was a controlled harvest at a couple of places, particularly on St. Paul and St. George Islands, and those seals were mostly subadult males that were being killed to provide skins and that fine fur to the markets that were around. But they continued to be harvested through the 80s, and then the fur seal, we let the treaty lapse, so they're unprotected at sea, but the mandate to continue to monitor them under the treaty lapsed, although it's NOAA continues to do what they can out there. So there were about a number of births, about 2,000 to 3,000 a year, and it's been increasing, but again affected by warm water events and also some disease, hookworm particularly, and some other things. And Guadalupe fur seals, they were also proclaimed extinct. There were very few of them left by the time Europeans arrived. Fur seals around the world had been hunted heavily for their pelts. Most species, which almost all of them live in the southern hemisphere, were just about annihilated. They've come back and come back very well. They have the ability to recover from very, very low levels and do very well, and over large periods of time. It's just they reproduce at early ages. They give birth every year, and they're very effective at fighting prey if it hasn't been removed from the system. So there was Aboriginal hunting on fur seals, some sealing by Europeans, and they were virtually undetected for a long, long time until George Bartholomew, who was a professor at UCLA, faculty at UCLA, was at San Nicolas Island studying the seals out there and found one adult male. So he convinced Carl Hubbs that they should go down to Guadalupe, which was the last refuge known for Guadalupe fur seals, to search for them. They did that. This was in the 1950s, early 50s, and they found a cave with maybe 14 to 50 fur seals. And those have recovered. They've grown at fairly high rates. The primary colony is still at Guadalupe Island, but it's still fairly small. Species abundance is about 14 to maybe 15,000 animals. We're seeing them more up here, particularly this year. There have been a lot of animals coming ashore. I think 20 at the Marine Mammal Center up in San Francisco has recovered. Right now there are 5 at SeaWorld San Diego. I think there have been a couple that have been, Ron says 2 here. So it's an interesting year for them too. But these are mostly all young animals or pups from last year with some exception. We've also done some genetic work with Guadalupe fur seals, both with animals that we can sample when they come into rehabilitation centers, and we also went through the archaeological record to determine what genetic variability was there. They haven't lost as much either, which is surprising, but their genetic variation is reduced from what it seems to have been historically from what we can gather from the archaeological records from the specimens we can get out of the Indian trash middens. So these are, again, Guadalupe fur seals that were rehabilitated and that we were able to instrument with satellite-linked radio transmitters and follow them for various periods of time. These are all young animals, pups of the year, except this one. They spend a lot of time further offshore, not really much known about the species at all, about their biology or in their foraging ranges or foraging habitats. So every time we instrument one, we hope to add to that database to inform us a little bit more about where they're spending their time and how they're making a living. This one was an adult female, Gloria, which we outfitted in January, I think, and then monitored, and she went to Cabo. And before she went to, I think she got caught in customs there, but it's interesting. So we're learning a little bit by doing this, but we really could benefit from having more, a little more funding so we could outfit more animals and have them doing it. All of these animals, again, we're limited in how long we can track them because they molt once a year. So they're going to lose the instruments. Most of the pups that we've monitored have come in to rehabilitation centers in late summer. We think they molt in fall, maybe early winter. So we only have a limited amount of time. The centers do not want to keep them. NOAA doesn't want them to stay there because they might be imprinted on humans. So the goal is to get them healthy and get them back out there. And if we instrument them at that time, it means we really won't get but a couple of months at most of tracking. Gloria was the exception because, in fact, we're going to try to instrument a couple animals in SeaWorld once they're ready to go in about a week and a half, and then we might get 6 months of tracking. So that's the goal with all of these animals that are returned. And that's about it. Any questions or comments you've got? Yes?
If you can flip the chart of the seals, you mentioned that a lot of the losses was due to the mothers abandoning the pups. So I'm assuming the chart that you shows them way down, these are just live pups, right? Because is this the total count of pups born, or is this just the live ones?
This is an estimate of the number of pups born each year.
But is this include the live and the dead ones? Because I know they walk the beach and they pull the dead ones up. So it's a cumulative, both live and dead.
So it's giving an index of really how many females are reproducing that year. And the drops are due to poor reproduction by the females that went through the big event, whatever that had been the year before.
Reproduction, not abandonment of the
No, that's what we're seeing right now. The abandonment is what we see, and the consequence often is the next year. If the system recovers, the females might be in good shape and they'll give birth the next year or the following year. You see right here, the 82-83 El Nino was a pretty intense one, and it took several years. This might have been some mortality of juveniles and non-recruitment into the population then, different than the rest of these years, or it could have been some adult mortality. But what you see is this is getting more intense, it seems, to swing as the population is getting larger. And that's one thing that I think, I don't know if it comes out in the press stories as much, is that we're seeing a lot of animals coming ashore. This was a record year, the biggest year ever for the numbers of animals that were admitted into rehabilitation centers. But the number of the pups that have been born are huge. There were about 65,000 pups born just a couple of years ago, and that's up. So there are large numbers of pups that are born. We don't know what happens, of course, to the ones that don't come on the beaches. If you go to the islands, we've done this and looked, the females, and it's generally older females that do better, and there are pups with them that look fine, but they're moving. If you go up the coast, there are animals that have started to show up, and they could be females that abandoned the pups and now have moved north to find better foraging up there. So we'll see what happens. I mean, it's tough to predict, I think, anymore what will happen the subsequent year or in the next couple of years, especially this year, since looks like we're going to have an El Nino following on top of this. Again, less production, less production of phytoplankton, less production of prey as a consequence.
Do you have an estimate of the total California sea lion population in the Santa Barbara Channel today?
It's a good
I've
question.
heard figures all over the
It's
map.
a tricky question because no one can count them all. So what we often do is you can look at for species that have good estimates of survival and reproduction, then you create life tables and you extrapolate or extract from that a factor that you can apply to the number of births. So it's a bit of magic, but generally it's 3 to 4 times for a lot of species of seals, fur seals and sea lions, and some of the true seals, 3 to 4 times the number of births that year. So if we took that for California sea lions, we've got 3 times 70,000, 210,000 to 4 times 70, which is a massive amount. I mean, there's a lot. So I'm guessing it's around 225 to 300,000 sea lions, but don't write that down because it's just a guess. And if you'll see, NOAA tries to do this every couple of years to really get an idea of how many animals are out there. But they're not all out there because the males are generally not here, and the subadult males are not here during most of the year. At the end of the breeding season, they head north. And they look very good. Their survival looks good, but they're up in Northern California, Oregon, and Washington eating salmon for most of the winter. And it's a really good food source for them. Then a lot of them do come back down in the Channel Islands to breed, or at least during the breeding season. But the last 10 years at least, there are these large aggregations of subadult and adult males that don't even attempt to compete. They're fat, they're healthy, they come down and they spend most of the 2 months in summer resting, and then they head north again. And the females are somewhat mobile too, but that depends on what's happening locally with their food supply.
You were talking about genetic diversity, especially with the elephant seals. Are pretty much, there isn't too much diversity now. But how about with the sea lions and seals? You were saying that some of them had little caves somewhere along the line. So it did create a bottleneck when we kind of wiped them out, but they're coming back. So is genetic diversity for seals and sea lions okay?
Well, sea lions look like there's quite a bit of variability still within their system, within their genome. Guadalupe fur seals too, but there was a refuge, and this is why elephant seals probably survived and were more numerous really at Guadalupe, even though they were at sea, because Guadalupe was really never inhabited by humans. So the first humans that got there were the Europeans, and they likely harvested Guadalupe fur seals there heavily, and the San Benitos. So the population may not hit. What might explain the less loss of diversity in sea lions and fur seals is the populations weren't maintained at very low levels throughout the range for long periods of time, like elephant seals were. Just a guess. And that's where you tend to lose a lot, more than just the rare alleles.
Any more
But
questions?
I don't know. Okay.
I've been up north and seen the California sea lions, like even as far as Avila Bay, not that far north, and they seem 3 times the size of the sea lions that I see on the buoy outside of Santa Barbara or on the islands in the channel. Why is that?
What time of year?
What time of year? I can't recall last time I was up north.
Well, there's that movement. So a lot of the animals, like
Yeah.
if you go to Pier 39 or you go to Astoria, go to Ballard Locks, those are often, well, they're older animals, but tend to be mostly subadult and adult males that are up there. So they look larger for that reason. You might, I don't know if you're seeing Sellers sea lions up there, but if you ever compare them, Sellers are massive. And occasionally they're falling out in those areas like at Onion Nuevo.
I
But
thought they might be, but they said no. Those are California
they're California
sea
sea
lions.
lions. They're
On
just,
the buoy in Avila.
yeah,
Bay,
they're adults and they're adult males.
and males. Yeah.
And the ones you see around here are juveniles or young females, again, borrowing food whenever they can get it.
Okay, thank you.
Questions? Any more?
You hadn't said anything about predators for these animals. Do they have any significance in these numbers?
Yeah, that's a good question about predators. There are predators. The ultimate predators, I think, are the parasites. So, but for large predators, killer whales and sharks, I think there's a myth about elephant seals being the favored prey of great white sharks, and because we don't really see much predation on sharks here by sharks at all. There's signs that California sea lions are attacked occasionally, maybe by blue sharks, maybe by younger white sharks when they come through because they're moving through the area. But we don't see much evidence, and the populations haven't shown evidence of heavy predation. But if you go to the Farallon Islands at the right time of the year, when it's known that the great whites, for example, aggregate there, and it's called the Red Triangle by some, and for reason because if you go there at the right time, there's a lot of blood in the water. And there are elephant seal colonies at the Farallons and Onion Nuevo. So those animals are taken. But when, it may not be many, but when you see it, it's pretty impressive. It's just like this last slide, you know, when you see an event like a attack by a great white, particularly on a friend, if you happen to be unlucky to see that yourself, it's impressive because it individualizes the whole thing, and it makes it look perhaps more important than it is. But clearly animals are being killed outright by great white sharks, blue sharks, and killer whales in some areas. But you see this is uncommon too. I mean, you don't see many big battles between adult male elephant seals, but when you do, it's impressive. So when you see a white throwing a fur seal or an elephant seal out of the water and taking it apart, it's pretty impressive. But we haven't seen much evidence. The population trends don't suggest that it's there. But it's hard to know because we don't really get to see the interactions.
Are there anti-parasitics that have been developed for these species? And are they given on a regular basis at all of these populations?
There are some, just like there are in, domestic animals, dogs, cats. There have been experiments with some species, particularly those that are endangered, like monk seals. But there was one, I don't know what the results are, there was an effort to try a hookworm vaccination on California sea lions. I don't know how well that went. But what you have, I think the key thing to understand or to know here is that everything that's done with marine mammals, I didn't say much about the Marine Mammal Protection Act. It was passed in 1972. Some think it had everything to do with these population recoveries, although, as I said, I think there are other reasons that can account for most of that, and killing wasn't happening. But there hasn't been any more killing. But the Marine Mammal Protection Act is blanket protection across the board for all marine mammals under U.S. jurisdiction, and that includes disturbance and harassment. There are exceptions to that prohibition on taking, which includes killing, harassment, And the exception, one of the key exceptions, is for scientific research. So to do what you're asking about requires a research permit, and that requires the public input. And it hasn't
So
been done.
there are only vaccinations, and there's no oral medications that could be.
Well, there could be, but it hasn't really been working. And we proposed kind of anticipating this increase in California sea lions and some of the issues that might come up. We tried to open a dialogue in the early 1980s and suggest experimenting, or at least trying, reproductive suppression with California sea lions. It's a system that would work. It's worked in other terrestrial mammals. These are polygynous animals, so if you suppress reproduction in a few males, you can have a great effect on the population. And that study was not funded, and at the time, some of the objections were that it might eliminate the possibility of lethal takes, which we really never expected would happen. But it hasn't been tested yet, but it would, even if the funding that was there would require a permit to go through that process. And I'm not sure how that would go, but at this time, disease isn't having a major effect on the population. So the reason to do it perhaps would be as a surrogate for another species that's really in trouble, like Hawaiian monk seals, for example. Ron.
Hi. Okay, so I have a couple tag questions. We were requested to try to track tags. Of course, on dead animals, that's very easy to do. Do you know the color codes for the, we see red tags, blue tags. I know orange tags is rehab, yellow, the different research groups, so that we know who to contact when we can't recover the tag, but you see the animal on the beach. You can get the information, but you don't know who to call because you don't know whose tag it is.
You can send the information to NOAA, the region. You interact with these guys all the time. But I'll tell you, there was a general agreement that we developed with NOAA's input in the regional input, regional office in the early 1980s. And the plan that we had come up with and most of us agreed to was that San Nicolas would be red tags, San Miguel would be yellow tags, Año Nuevo were green, and Farallones was pink. There are a few more colors to use, but it gets a little more complicated. So that's what many of us have stuck to, but at times there have been researchers that have been using various other tags, so I can't tell you. But I get a lot of these, and I try to respond to that if I know what species it was and what color it was. We've also used different kinds of tags. I know the NOAA provides tags to the rehabilitation centers, which are the orange Roto-Reese tags, but we've used, even in individual studies, we've used different tags. But Pam and at least and I have tried to keep them to the same color. And there have been northern fur seals. NOAA has used pink tags on northern fur seals in the past. I don't know what they're using now.
Okay, one more.
Okay.
Okay, we've been noticing that the tag numbers are not matching the Freeze brand numbers.
Yeah. Okay.
And can you explain what Freeze branding?
Well, those are hot
process
brands.
are?
The one that your wife has on there, that's a hot brand on a California sea lion, and that's NOAA's program. They don't match, as far as I know. They're just straight numbers, and they started branding in the late 80s, I think. And so it's really, I'm sorry? Yes. Yeah. I'll hold it. There's a hot brand on a California sea lion pup, so the NOAA is doing this. And that's just a series. And I think maybe that's a V at the end. So they're truly trying to keep it to 4 digits, maybe an alphanumeric series. And the tag is independent, and usually those tags are added. It's hard to read these tags on the rookeries after water colonies. So they went to branding to try and keep track, collect data on survival and fecundity of California sea lions. They got a lot of good data on that. But so the tags won't match the brands as far as I know. It's tough to match them. All of these tags that are used, the flipper tags, they're livestock tags. So we didn't have these made specifically for seals and sea lions. They're just standard sheep, goat, cattle tags, which work pretty well for at least short periods of time.
Can you tell us more about the Steller sea lions, and especially, are we going to see more of them in this area?
What can I say about Steller sea lions? It's been an interesting story because they declined in the Aleutians, in various parts of the Aleutians, off of Alaska from the 60s through the 80s. They were listed, were divided into different stocks. The Western Aleutian stock is still fairly low. We're still talking about tens of thousands of them. The Eastern Aleutians were protected, I think, is threatened for quite a long time. I think they've been delisted. Gulf of Alaska, British Columbia. In the Eastern North Pacific, the numbers have been increasing. I think well, according to managers. And they did occur down here until the 1920s, 30s, and there was, I think, the last animal was seen in the mid-80s. But there are animals showing up. When they do, you can't miss them because they're just so big. I know this one I've seen, I don't know if it's the same one, but there's one that's been on the buoy. I think there are small numbers that are being seen on San Miguel. But I don't know, I can't say if they're going to come back or not. It really, I think, depends on whether there's food for them here, which is different kinds of prey than the California sea lions eat, and whether they're actually moving down. There was a big colony on Nuevo Island for a long time, and that declined. So I don't know how to answer your question. I think they're being seen more often. It may just be individuals that tend to stay, and you'll see them regularly rather than large number of animals that you might see one or two at a time.
Any more questions? One more.
I was wondering if you might want to comment on, you mentioned that the warm water event that had been occurring recently has been an atmospheric driven phenomena. Is this related to the blob that was recently talked about in some of the science magazines, and how that may be related to the, I guess a predictable, this incoming El Nino event that they're, surmising is going to.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I've watched the media, I've watched the press, and it's always confusing. The media loves correlations, and it's just, the blob was a real surprise to me, but it's a great, thing, this warm blob. I don't know what's caused that. It could be atmospheric changes. If the water is warming in situ right there, it's likely because there's less cold water that's coming up. Could be circulation changes. But in general, the warm water events that we see, they start in the Western Pacific and the tropics. Atmospheric circulation changes. Oceanic currents change a little bit. And that warm water starts to, which is higher, the sea level is higher in the Western Pacific, and it starts to move over this way. And that's when you start seeing it in the Eastern Pacific, which is generally around Ecuador, the Galapagos, and that's, of course, why it was called El Nino, because it started to show up in Christmas time, the time of the Christ child, El Nino. So it was called that. And that's where the warm water came, and then it would often, you'd see movements or warming of water up the coast, and that's what we would see as far north as Point Conception, at least. So I don't know how, this blob, I don't know what it is. I keep reading a lot of stuff, and I'm not going to, well, I am. I'm leaving for Dubai tomorrow for a couple weeks, so I could just go off the bat and say whatever I want, I guess. But I don't know. And I think we're going to see what happens. Whether they're independent events or they're linked, we're just going to have to wait and see and try to sort it out. And the next time, be prepared to try and figure out what's happening at the time that it is happening.
Do you have a question? No questions? Okay, no more questions. Thank you, Brent, so
Okay.
much.
Thank you.